So if you turn to the first page, you'll see where we're adding to an exemption. And this matter has been brought to our attention by a constituent. Presently, a person is able to practice upon their relatives in the person's home as long as they don't charge compensation. However, if for example, grandmother can't leave her home or is in a rest home, then there's no way for one of her relatives to help her with her hair, basically. And so what this scenario will allow is that a person practicing on a relative in the relative's home without compensation would be exempt from the licensure requirements. This actually happened out there. It was brought to our attention by a constituent and the constituent's legislator. The board doesn't have a concern with it, doesn't believe that this would in any way jeopardize the health, safety, or welfare. And so obviously we're looking to add an exemption from the licensure requirement, in essence, reducing regulation as it relates to that scenario.
Representative Batt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Hales. I had a question about the persons practicing on relatives. So why does it just need to be in the relative's home? So if I were to have a family member that had a shop and I went in and they wanted to do my hair for free, they couldn't do that?
Mr. Hales.
Chairman, Representative Batt. Well, if you had a relative that had a cosmetology shop, then they would be licensed. Obviously, this doesn't relate to that. This relates to a situation where, for example, you may have a granddaughter that does not have a license, but has traditionally helped grandma with her hair. And it facilitates a scenario where grandma is in a rest home, for example, or some other type of residence, and she may not be able to travel easily, and so that granddaughter could still go to the relative's home and perform that service without having to be licensed.
Stevenson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Hales, I have a question again on the first page, line 24, 25, and then the next section. So is there a definition of home anywhere?
Mr. Hales.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Stevenson, there is not.
And a follow-up. So, and the part number 5, does a medical confinement consist of somebody being in a rest home? Would that be what that would be? In addition to some obvious when there's a medical restraining order or something in a hospital. But
Mr. Chairman, Representative Stevenson, a couple of things at play here. Typically in this profession, you not only have to be a licensed cosmetologist, but you have to practice in a licensed shop. Okay, two things going on. So the section you've referenced relates to a licensed cosmetologist practicing in other than a shop. And that's where maybe it's a jail circumstance, maybe it's medical confinement, maybe it's a hospital. But that's the exemption that allows the licensee to practice outside of a licensed shop in certain circumstances. Okay.
Follow-up.
yes, so Mr. Chairman, let me try to understand. In the section 5 there, starting with line 26, that applies to licensed persons already licensed, whereas the people in number 4 may not be licensed, correct? Mr. Chairman, I guess one question I have is, why do we even need to define if someone is not licensed? Why does government even need to be defined as participating in the event that's defined in number 4?
Mr. Hales.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Stevenson, well, right now, if you cut somebody else's hair and you're not licensed to do that, and you don't otherwise meet one of these exemptions, you're violating the law. And so Right now, a person without a license is not able to work on a relative in the relative's home, essentially. However, a person without a license can work on people in their own home as long as they're not charging compensation and not performing it for the general public, which is generally meant for the immediate family scenario. You can cut your kid's hair in your house as long as you're not charging compensation. That's always been the case. It's based on this exemption. So we're simply trying to add an exemption that would allow someone to go to their relative's house if their relative can't come to their house and not be in violation of law.
Representative?
So am I to understand that if all these years when all of us cut our children's hair and so on, and it may not be in our home, but let's say theirs, or that we've been out of compliance with law? I mean, who's going to turn us in?
Mr. Hales?
Well, maybe you put your finger on it. I mean, I'm not sure people are overly concerned with cutting their children's hair, and if they do it in their own home, there's a clear exemption for that. But this is the typical approach to the regulation of a profession. I mean, you make certain things required, meaning if you're going to cut hair, you need to have a license, you need to do it in a shop, but then they start exempting things out from that, and that's pretty typical, and these exemptions have been in place for a long time, and I think have served the profession well, and we're simply looking to add another exemption. We're trying to deregulate a practice out there. So.
Representative Crane?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Hales. So kind of to follow up on the line of questioning of Representative Stevenson. So I was talking with someone last week who used to cut hair as a way to cut hair in a dorm situation at college as a way to offset some of the college costs. So that individual is in violation of state law for cutting other guys' hair in the dorm?
Mr. Hales?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Crane, based upon the way you've described that, probably.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Hale. So if my wife chooses to go over to her grandma's house and cut her grandma's hair, she would be in violation of the law. Is that correct?
Mr. Hales?
Under the present law.
Follow up.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hale. So why does a licensed cosmetologist or hairstylist also have to practice in a licensed shop? Why are we licensing the cosmetologist and we're licensing the location in which they can practice? Instead of saying, you're licensed with the state of Idaho, you can practice anywhere you want in the state of Idaho.
Mr. Hales?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Crane, there are certain types of professions where the legislatures felt it important that they practice in an area that has certain sanitary requirements. And the shop requirements have always been in place in this profession, and those shops are licensed, and the license primarily is designed to verify that the shop is going to be sanitary when it comes to performing those services. There's a few professions where board licenses shops or establishments, crematories, for example.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hale. I mean, if we're on the line of deregulating, I mean, how would the department feel in moving forward with saying, hey, if you're licensed within the state of Idaho, you can use that license in any licensed shop, not just that that license has to be used at this licensed location?
Mr. Hale?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Crane, I'm not sure how the board would feel about that. I'd be happy to follow up with them in that regard. But to be honest with you, this is, this statutory scheme where you license the individual and you also license where they work is fairly consistent throughout, I believe, the country. Fairly consistent. It's been in place for a long time. But obviously, That is the scenario.
Just a comment, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Rose, yeah, if you could follow up with them, I would be curious to know, how the board feels about that maybe in the future. Thank you. Certainly.
Representative Monks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Hales, thank you for being brave enough to bring the first RS to a committee. Seems like we've all got a lot of questions. And I realize this is just an RS hearing, and we're not really debating the merits of this. But I guess my question kind of goes back to that line 24 on 4 when we talk about persons practicing on relatives. And I know we're lessening the requirements here, which I applaud you. Thank you very much for bringing these exemptions. But I'm wondering if we shouldn't maybe look at the way this is written a little bit. And my question is, so a sister does her sister's hair all the time, always has done. They're traveling now, they're in a hotel. Or the grandmother that you had mentioned, there is no provision that for in a hotel, because we keep referring back to houses and homes, that we didn't broaden that and expand that a little bit more. So I guess if you could comment on why we just specified just homes for these relatives to be able to practice on.
Mr. Hales.
Well, Mr. Chairman, Representative Monks, the issue that we were trying to deal with is a relative that really couldn't travel from their home. And so that was the scenario that we were trying to work on, deregulate, so to speak. There are concerns about where you practice on a person. And typically sanitation is an issue when it comes to various practices of a cosmetologist. And so I think that was the thought, that we still wanted to somewhat regulate where you're doing this, but certainly wanted to open it up so that you could not only practice on your relative in your own home or go to the relative's home. But understand your point as far as just eliminating any limitation on where you practice on a relative. But the particular issue we were trying to accomplish dealt with practicing in the relative's home, since they were more or less housebound.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess if we're not setting sanitary standards in the home, then what's the difference if it's a home or a hotel or a third-party home? You're traveling, you're staying with a friend. So we're not really setting standards for how clean the homes are, and that was one of the reasons why we regulate the facility, the location apparently. So if we're not setting those standards for the home, then what's the difference if we specify here just for the home, I guess?
Mr. Hales.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Monks, I guess the perception is that one's going to maintain their house. Granted, we're not trying to regulate that house, and I understand your point, but maybe the concern out there is if you were cutting somebody's hair in the back alley, for example. I don't know. But the point being is that in the circumstance that we were trying to resolve, it was the relative in the relative's home.
Representative Rushi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a question that I need some information on. Are we not delving so much into the substance of the bill that we're neglecting our duty to ensure that the bill and the statement of purpose are adequate for the purpose of consideration once we have testimony? I think that we're running a little deep here.
I think we have members that are very conscientious and are trying to understand the issue the best they can before they send this issue to be printed. So, thank you. Representative Crane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to that end, I'm going to make a substitute motion that we introduce to print RS 22386, and I think maybe with these changes we could potentially solve the department's problem and alleviate the committee's concern. And that would be on line 24, we'll introduce to print with these changes. It would say persons practicing on a relative, but strike out in the relative's home and then leave without compensation. I think that might accomplish some of the concerns. 378, I'm sorry, Mr. Artis, thank you.
Mr. Chairman,